They call it the Holy Land, but the roots of the holy story reach deeper south. Long before parchment or prophets, before temples or tribes, the first whispers of the divine rose from the heart of Africa. On the banks of the Nile, where sunlight kissed the earth with eternal fire, people spoke of spirit, of balance, of creation flowing from a single source. Humanity was not yet divided by color or creed. The sacred still spoke in the language of rivers, wind, and stone. In the beginning, there was not just a garden, there was a geography. The rivers of Genesis, flowing from one source to 4 streams, were no mythic imagination. They were memory, echoes of the Nile's great veins, stretching through lands the ancients called Cush, Punt, and Kemet. It was here that the first stories of order and chaos, of law and justice, were carved into stone, sung in hymns, and lived in ritual. The soil that birthed civilization also birthed the sacred imagination. But history, like scripture, can be rewritten. Over centuries, as empires rose and fell, the story's compass shifted. The holy narrative, once anchored in African sun and soil, was redrawn across foreign maps. The cradle of revelation, Africa, was quietly replaced by the deserts of Western imagination. The faces that shaped the earliest faiths were painted lighter, their tongues retranslated. What was once African became called ancient Near Eastern. The center of the world was moved, and Africa was turned into its margin. Yet the earth does not forget. Beneath layers of conquest and silence, the rivers still flow, the temples still whisper, and the names, Cush, Mizraim, Sheba, Ethiopia, still breathe through the pages of the Bible and the Torah. Africa remains the unspoken verse in the world's holiest song. The book that shaped humanity did not begin in the cold stone halls of Europe. It began beneath the African sun, among people who understood the divine not as distance, but as rhythm, breath, and life itself. Before the word was written on tablets, it was inscribed on the hearts of those who lived by the Nile. And as we trace its roots, we return not just to history, but to the memory of who we truly are. Genesis opens not as a myth, but as a map. It speaks of rivers, lands, and boundaries, a sacred geography that ties heaven's story to the earth's oldest soil. When the text tells of a river that went out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it parted and became 4 heads, it's not describing fantasy, it's recalling a landscape. Those rivers, Pishon, Gihon, Hiddekel, and Euphrates, have long been symbols of life and divine order. Yet when you follow the oldest traditions, one river stands out, the Gihon, said to compass the whole land of Cush. Cush was not a metaphor. Cush was Africa. Cush was Nubia, the ancient kingdom stretching from southern Egypt deep into modern Sudan, where the white and blue Nile meet. The very mention of Cush in Genesis 2:13 anchors Eden within the African world. Early Hebrew and Ethiopian scholars understood this, drawing their Eden not in Mesopotamia, but at the cradle of the Nile. For them, the river was not just water, it was memory, flowing through the veins of creation itself. In ancient times, maps told theology. Early Jewish, Coptic, and Islamic scholars located paradise near the sources of the Nile, describing it as a mountain from which rivers descended in 4 directions, the heart of the earth, the navel of the world. These maps didn't separate Africa from the holy story. They placed it at its center. The land of Cush, the realm of Punt, and the riches of Ethiopia were seen not as exotic, but as sacred, the divine workshop where God first breathed life into clay. Even linguistics bears witness. The Hebrew word Eden shares ancient echoes with Sumerian and possibly Egyptian words for plain or delight. But the concept of paradise, of divine order in balance with nature, is older than any text. In Kemet, long before the book of Genesis was written, priests spoke of the field of reeds, a place of harmony where the righteous lived eternally among rivers and light. The idea of a moral afterlife, where the soul was judged and restored to divine balance, was an African inheritance long before it became Hebrew scripture. The Bible's earliest geography is therefore not a journey away from Africa, but through it. The lands of Cush, Mizraim, Egypt, and Put were not foreign territories. They were the ancestral backdrop of humanity's story. Archaeological evidence from Nabta Playa, near the Egyptian-Sudanese border, reveals ancient astronomical stone circles older than Stonehenge, aligned with the stars and seasons, marking humankind's earliest efforts to understand cosmic order. These were the same lands whose civilizations inspired the notion of divine law, sacred time and the written word. But somewhere along the corridors of translation and empire, Africa's presence was dimmed. Maps shifted northward. Scholars reimagined Eden as somewhere near modern Iraq, and the word Cush was recast as distant Ethiopia. Not the vibrant African nation it was, but an abstract realm. The soil that once birthed Genesis was painted over by the politics of empire. Yet the deeper one reads, the more Africa's fingerprints return, in its rivers, its names, its symbols of life. To read the opening pages of the Bible is to read Africa. Its rivers, its dust, its dawn. It's to hear the whisper of the Nile as the first hymn of creation. Before doctrine, before exile, before even sin, there was water. And that water ran from the heart of Africa. And so as the story of faith unfolds, it is upon African soil that we must stand to understand its beginning. For the book's first garden grew not in a mythic east, but in the sunlit cradle of the south, where the divine and the human first met in the language of creation itself. Before the tablets, before Sinai, before the thunder and the flame, there was Kemet, the Black Land, a civilization that stood not in myth, but in the heat of the African sun, where stone was turned to scripture and temples became schools of eternity. It was here, thousands of years before the first verses of Genesis were written, that humanity learned to name the divine through order, balance, and moral law. The world called it Egypt, but to its children, it was Kemet, the land where God was studied through light itself. Kemet was not only a kingdom, it was a classroom. The great temples of Luxor and Karnak were more than monuments. They were universities of spirit. Within their walls, priests studied astronomy, medicine, ethics, and the mathematics of the cosmos. They spoke of Ma'at, truth, justice, harmony, the principle that governed not only the stars but the human heart. This African idea that the universe was sustained by moral order would later echo through the Ten Commandments and the Psalms. Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not bear false witness. These were not inventions of a desert people, but continuations of a moral current that had already flowed for millennia along the Nile. It is no coincidence that Abraham, the patriarch of Israel, journeyed into Egypt during famine, not merely for survival, but for wisdom. The early texts record that Egypt was a land of grain and knowledge, a place where divine understanding was both preserved and embodied. Centuries later, Moses, the prophet who would define the law, was born into that same civilization. Raised as a prince in Pharaoh's house, educated in the mysteries of Kemet, Moses learned to read the stars, to measure the river, to understand the rhythm of divine cycles. When he would one day stand upon Mount Sinai, the laws he inscribed would bear the echoes of what he had already known. In Kemet, it was said that the heart of the dead was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, and only those whose hearts were light with truth could enter eternity. In Israel, it would be written, "The Lord weighs the heart." These were not separate revelations, different tongues speaking the same eternal wisdom. Even the sacred architecture tells the story. The Ark of the Covenant, carried through the wilderness, mirrors the portable shrines of Kemet, gilded chests with wings of divine guardians borne on poles by priests. The tabernacle's design, with its inner sanctum where only the high priest could enter, echoes the Holy of Holies of Egyptian temples, chambers that symbolize the union of heaven and earth. But the deeper link is philosophical. In Kemet, creation was spoken into existence by Ta, the god whose word became form. He spoke, and the world took shape. Every word of the god came to pass as he spoke it. Thousands of years later, in the scrolls of Genesis, that voice reappears. And God said, "Let there be light." The creative word, the Logos, was an African revelation before it became Hebrew theology. Kemet was not merely a neighbor to Israel. It was its teacher, its mirror, its memory. The prophets did not invent holiness. They inherited it. In the rhythm of the Nile, in the weighing of the heart, in the silence of the pyramids aligned to the stars, Africa had already written the preface to the Bible and the Torah. The Exodus, then, was not an escape from Africa. It was a return with her wisdom. The staff of Moses, the law on stone, the vision of divine order, all these were carried from the cradle of Kemet into the story of Israel. Africa was the first theologian, and from her temples, her philosophies, and her soil, the world learned how to name the sacred. Beyond the sands of Egypt lies the ancient land of Cush, a name that echoes through both scripture and history. It was here, along the deep bends of the Nile, that one of Africa's most enduring civilizations flourished, Nubia. To the ancients, Nubia was no distant province. It was a kingdom of gold, faith, and power. A place the Bible names again and again, though centuries of interpretation have learned to read past it. In the genealogies of Genesis, the sons of Ham, Cush, Mizraim, and Put are listed as the fathers of nations. Yet these were not outsiders to the story of Israel. They were the elder kin of its landscape. The Cushites built cities when the world beyond the Nile was still silent. Their trade caravans connected Africa to Arabia and Canaan. Their kings corresponded with pharaohs, and their gods were invoked beside those of Kemet. When the prophets of Israel spoke of Cush stretching forth her hands unto God, they spoke of a people already known for devotion and strength. The biblical world was not divided by color, but by covenant, and Africa stood close to its center. The prophet Zephaniah, one of the 12 minor prophets, identifies himself as the son of Cushi, a direct acknowledgement of African descent. The book of Jeremiah honors Ebed-Melech, an Ethiopian who risked his life to save the prophet from death, and whom God personally blessed for his righteousness. In the Chronicles of Kings, Cushite armies fought beside Judah, their valor recorded in the same ink as Israel's own. And then there's the Queen of Sheba, Makeda, as she is remembered in Ethiopian tradition. Her journey to Jerusalem is not merely one of curiosity. It is the symbolic union of Africa and Israel, wisdom meeting wisdom. When she stands before King Solomon, bearing gold, spices, and riddles, the exchange between them is more than diplomacy. It is the recognition of equals. In her visit lies the beginning of Ethiopia's Solomonic dynasty, a royal line that would claim descent from both Sheba and Solomon, preserved in the ancient Kebra Nagast. That lineage, they say, carried the Ark of the Covenant to Africa, a treasure not lost, but kept in trust. These are not marginal tales. They are the veins through which the sacred story breathes. Every time the scriptures mention Cush, Sheba, or Ethiopia, they are remembering Africa, her people, her wisdom, her loyalty to God. Yet over centuries, those names were turned into footnotes. The kingdoms of Nubia and Cush, which built pyramids that rivaled Egypt's own, were written out of sacred geography. Their queens, Amanirenas, Amani-Shakedo, Candace, once powerful rulers mentioned in ancient texts, became shadows in the margins of theology. But the scrolls still whisper their names. In Acts 8, an Ethiopian official travels from Africa to Jerusalem to worship, the first recorded non-Jewish believer to embrace the message of the Messiah. His conversion did not mark the beginning of Africa's faith. It was its return to the source it helped form. When we trace the Bible's bloodlines honestly, Africa stands not at the periphery, but at the heart of Revelation. From the royal courts of Sheba to the prophets of Cush, the continent was not watching faith from afar. It was shaping it, sheltering it, and sending its sons and daughters into its story. Before theology drew its borders, Africa walked freely through the pages of the sacred text. And though history tried to erase her, the script still remembers. Every river, every name, every queen who carried light from the south toward Jerusalem. There are places on earth where time still moves to the rhythm of scripture, where the line between myth and memory blurs in the glow of sacred fire. Ethiopia is one such place. High in her mountains, veiled in mist and mystery, stands the ancient city of Axum, the legendary resting place of the Ark of the Covenant. For thousands of years, Ethiopians have guarded a story that links their royal blood to the house of David, a story both whispered and proclaimed. That the Ark, once kept in Jerusalem, was carried to Africa, not stolen but received. The tale is told in the Kebra Nagast, Ethiopia's great national epic. It recounts how Makeda, the Queen of Sheba, visited King Solomon in search of divine wisdom. From their union came a son, Menelik I, who journeyed back to Ethiopia carrying both royal blood and sacred law. Tradition holds that when Menelik returned, the Ark of the Covenant accompanied him, not as an act of theft, but of divine appointment. To this day, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church teaches that the Ark rests in the chapel of the tablet in Axum, guarded by a single monk who never leaves its presence until death. Whether one takes this as legend or legacy, the faith surrounding it is undeniable. In no other place on earth has the covenant of Israel been preserved with such devotion, nor its rituals so faithfully mirrored. Ethiopia's liturgy remains one of the world's oldest, sung in Ge'ez, an ancient Semitic tongue closely related to Hebrew. Its priests still wear white linen robes like those of the Levites. Its prayers still rise with the smoke of frankincense. In the highlands of Lalibela, entire churches were carved into living rock, a New Jerusalem in Africa, where pilgrims still walk barefoot in the dust of saints. Long before Rome built cathedrals, Ethiopia was already a fortress of faith. The Book of Acts records that the first non-Jewish follower of Christ was an Ethiopian eunuch, a royal official serving the Queen of Candace. On a lonely road between Jerusalem and Gaza, he met the apostle Philip, read from the prophet Isaiah, and found in those words the Messiah. When he descended into the water, Ethiopia entered the Christian story, not as a convert of empire, but as a child returning home. From that moment, the African church took root in Nubia, in Axum, in the deserts of the Copts. It flourished centuries before Europe's kings wore the cross. When Rome still hunted believers in its arenas, Ethiopian monks were already preserving the Psalms in hand-painted manuscripts, their margins adorned with black angels and golden halos. The libraries of Axum became sanctuaries of Hebrew and Greek texts, copied by hands that believed words were sacred breath. Ethiopia was not a frontier of faith, it was its refuge. When the ark vanished from Israel's sight, it was said to have found rest here. When the early church was persecuted, it found sanctuary here. And when the colonial world came to redraw the map of holiness, Ethiopia stood unmoved. The one Christian kingdom that had never been colonized, never converted by sword, never lost its ancient name. The fires of Axum still burn, pilgrims still gather, and somewhere, behind stone and silence, a lone guardian still prays beside the ark. Whether legend or truth, Ethiopia's devotion stands as testimony that Africa did not merely cradle the sacred story, she kept it alive when the world forgot. Long before Moses lifted the tablets, before prophets spoke of heaven and law, Africa had already defined the moral architecture of the universe. Across the temples of Kemet, the pyramids of Cush, and the libraries of Axum, the ancients spoke of Ma'at, the rhythm of truth, balance, and divine order that held both stars and souls in place. To live outside Ma'at was to live in chaos. To walk in Ma'at was to live in harmony with creation itself. It was this African idea that morality was not a rule imposed by gods, but the natural law of existence, that later shaped the ethics of the Hebrew prophets. When Moses delivered the Ten Commandments, he was not introducing morality to humanity. He was reaffirming a code already ancient in African thought. Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not bear false witness. Each of these had been inscribed centuries earlier in the wisdom texts of Kemet. On papyrus scrolls like the instruction of Ptahhotep and the instruction of Amenemope, Egyptians taught their children to speak truth, honor parents, respect life, and care for the poor. Portions of Amenemope's teachings were so closely mirrored in the Book of Proverbs that scholars now recognize them as direct parallels. Do not move the boundary stone of the fatherless, a commandment echoing both Hebrew and Kemetic justice. In the theology of Ptah, the creative god of Memphis, the world was spoken into being. He gave life to all gods and all things through his heart and his tongue, says an inscription from 700 BCE. In Genesis, that same sacred rhythm reappears. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. The word, the Logos, was not born in Greece or Israel, it was first sung in Africa. The voice that called creation from silence was an African sound. Even the soul's anatomy reveals this shared philosophy. In Kemet, the human being was composed of Ka, the life force, Ba, the personality or spirit, and Ak, the divine spark. Together they formed the trinity of existence, life, spirit, and eternal essence. The Hebrew scriptures would later describe the same triad as Nefesh, life, Ruach, spirit, and Neshama, divine breath. Different tongues, same revelation, that divinity lives within, not above humankind. In the concept of Ma'at, the judgment of the heart before the feather became the moral foundation for later ideas of divine justice. The weighing of souls, the book of life, the last judgment. These were not borrowed images, they were shared truths. Africa had always known that righteousness was not ritual, but balance, that to be just was to move in tune with creation itself. The Bible did not fall from the sky, it rose from the wisdom of the earth. Its earliest truths were not discovered, they were remembered, and the soil that remembered them first was African. Every story of Revelation carries two chapters, one of memory and one of erasure. For centuries, Africa's name was written boldly into the sacred texts. But in the age of empire, new hands took up the pen. They drew new borders on old maps, and in doing so, they redrew the story of God. The erasure began not with conquest of land, but with conquest of language. 19th century theologians in Europe began to relocate Eden, redefining Cush and Mizraim, not as African, but as abstract names of forgotten places. Maps that once showed the rivers of Genesis flowing from the Nile were repainted, moving paradise into Mesopotamia. Egypt became a Near Eastern mystery instead of an African civilization. Ethiopia became the other, exotic and distant, rather than the living heart of biblical memory. In art, too, the transformation took form. The prophet's skin paled, the deserts grew whiter, and Christ himself was painted with the face of empire. The Holy Family fled into Egypt, but in European paintings, Egypt no longer looked African. The Nile lost its color, and so did its people. Theology followed the brush. When the maps and the art changed, belief followed silently. Colonial scholars spoke of Africa as pagan, yet quoted her wisdom without name. They borrowed Ma'at and called it moral law. They took Kemet's mysticism and called it Hermeticism. They lifted the geometry of the pyramids and built their cathedrals upon its design. But they never said the word Africa. In silence, the theft was sanctified. And so a continent that had birthed faith was taught to see itself as faithless. Generations of Africans were told that God was foreign, that holiness came from elsewhere, that their ancestors were idolaters, not architects of revelation. Missionaries carried Bibles printed in European languages to the same soil that had once given birth to sacred thought. But history does not die when it is buried. Beneath the ruins, beneath the manuscripts, beneath the memory of conquest, the old truth still breathes. Africa remembers. Her rivers remember. The papyrus still whispers where it was born. The silence imposed upon the continent is breaking. And with every discovery, every uncovered text, every ancient name reclaimed, the story begins to speak again, in its original tongue, under its original sun. The truth has always known how to find its way home. After centuries of silence, distortion, and exile, the story is returning to the land where it began, to the cradle that once held both man and meaning. Africa, the first altar, the first classroom, the first holy ground, is remembering herself. The winds that move across the Nile still carry the breath of Genesis. The stones of Axum, of Nubia, of Kemet still pulse with scripture older than text, stories written not in ink, but in light. To remember this is not rebellion. It is restoration. For too long, faith was divided by geography, as if holiness could be owned by one people or place. But the soil tells no lies. The DNA of Scripture runs through African rivers, African temples, African tongues. The Torah's echoes are heard in the hymns of the Nile. The Bible's rhythm beats in the drums of the continent. To recognize this is not to divide religion, it is to heal it. It is to see that before the world was split by empire, faith had one voice, and it spoke in the language of the sun. Every rediscovered truth is an act of resurrection. When we acknowledge Africa's role in the sacred story, we are not rewriting Scripture. We are reading it again for the first time, as it was meant to be read. Whole, luminous, human. The prophet's journeys, the wisdom of Kemet, the covenant of Ethiopia, they are chapters of one eternal testament. A testament that began not in the cold stones of cathedrals, but in the warm earth of creation itself. The word began here, on African soil, under African skies, in African hearts. Written by hands that knew both sand and spirit, by people who looked to the stars and saw themselves reflected in the divine. And so the memory returns, not as accusation, but as awakening. For every child who is told that holiness came from elsewhere, this truth is your inheritance. The Bible and the Torah are branches. Their root is Africa. If this restored something sacred in you, share it, not for fame, but for remembrance. Comment Africa Remembers and subscribe to Deep in History, where truth returns home.